Now let's talk about your cerebrum. It is the largest part of the brain, situated in the anterior and middle cranial fossa of the skull and occupying the whole concavity of the vault of the skull. It has two parts. You have your diencephalon, in which it forms the central core, and your telencephalon, in which it forms the cerebral hemispheres. Next, the cerebral cortex. So it is a region of gray matter that forms the outer rim of the cerebrum with an inner white matter. So it forms a complete covering of the whole cerebral hemisphere, and during embryonic development, the gray matter of the cortex enlarges faster than the deeper white matter. So the cortical region rolls and folds is called your gyri or gyrus or convolutions, while the deepest grooves between folds is called your fissures, while the more shallow grooves between the folds is called your sulcus or your sulci. The longitudinal fissure, it is the most prominent fissure. It separates the cerebrum into right and left cerebral hemispheres. You have a term there, you have your falx cerebri, in which it is a sickle-shaped structure that lies within the longitudinal fissure between the cerebral hemisphere. Then you have another term, you have your corpus callosum. It is a broad band of white matter containing the axons that extends between the hemispheres. So basically it connects the hemispheres internally. Next will be the structure and functional localization of the cerebral cortex. You have different types of nerve cells present in the cerebral cortex. First is your pyramid cells. So we have a term there, your Betz cells. This refers to the giant pyramid cells. It is called your pyramid cells since it has a pyramid-shaped cell bodies. So these Betz cells can be seen in the motor precentral gyrus or gyrus in the frontal lobe. It contains numerous dendritic spines with axon ending in the deeper cortical layers as a projection, association, or commissural fiber. Next, you have your stellate cells, also known as your granule cells. It is small and polygonal in shape, and it has a multiple branching dendrites with axons ending on a nearby neuron. Next, you have your fusiform cells. It is found on the deepest cortical layers. So the dendrites arises from each pole of the cell body, with axons entering the white matter as either a projection, association, or commissural fiber. Next, you have your horizontal cells of Cajal. It is a small fusiform, horizontally oriented cells found in the most superficial layers of the cortex. So the dendrite emerges from each end of the cell with axons that is running parallel to the cortical surface of the cortex. Next, you have the cells of Martinotti. It is a small multipolar cells present in all cortical levels. It has short dendrites with axons ending on a more superficial layer. Now let's talk about the layers of the cerebral cortex on which the nerve cells are situated. First is your molecular layer or your plexiform layer. It is the most superficial and consists of large numbers of synapses. Next, you have your external granular layer. It is a large number of pyramidal and stellate cells. You have the dendrites of the cells in this layer that terminates into the molecular layer with the axons entering the white matter of the cerebral hemisphere. Next, we have the external pyramidal layer. So there is positive pyramidal cells whose body cell size increases from superficial into deeper borders of the layer. The apical dendrites passes into the molecular layer, whereas the axons enter the white matter as either a projection, association, or commissural fibers. Then you have your internal granular layer. It is composed of a closely packed stellate cells with a high concentration of horizontally arranged fibers that serves as the external band of Biarja. Then you have your ganglionic layer, also known as your internal pyramidal layer. It consists of very large and medium-sized pyramidal cells with scattered stellate cells and the cells of Martinotti. You also have your Betz cells in this layer. Then the last, you have your multiform layer, or the layer of your polymorphic cells. It consists of many nerve fibers that are present that are entering or leaving the underlying white matter. Each cerebral hemisphere can be further subdivided into several lobes. The lobes are named after the bones that cover them. You have the frontal, parietal, temporal, and occipital lobes. So here are the four main sulci. So what separates the frontal from the parietal lobe? It's your central sulcus. Okay, then you have your precentral gyrus or gyrus. It is located in front or anterior to the central sulcus. Okay, so it is the primary motor area of the cerebral cortex. Okay, then you have your postcentral gyrus. It is located behind or posterior to the central sulcus, in which it serves as the primary somatosensory area of the cerebral cortex. Next, you have the lateral cerebral sulcus or fissure. So this time it separates the frontal lobe from the temporal lobe. Again, lateral central sulcus or fissure. It separates the frontal lobe from the temporal lobe. So you have the inferior and lateral surfaces of the cerebral hemisphere. Then you have the insula. Okay, so the insula, it lies within the lateral cerebral sulcus, deep to the parietal, frontal, and temporal lobes. Then you have your parieto-occipital sulcus. So by the name itself, it separates the parietal lobe from the occipital lobe. So in It is located 2 inches anterior to the occipital pole and passes downward and anteriorly on the medial surface to meet the calcarine sulcus. Then the last, you have the calcarine sulcus. So it is located on the medial surface of the hemisphere and joined at an acute angle by the parieto-occipital sulcus. Now let's talk about the lobes of the cerebrum. First is your frontal lobe. It is mainly for intelligence, personality and behavior, motor, and your Broca's area can be seen here. Okay, specifically on the third frontal convolution. Okay, then it is the area anterior or in front of the central sulcus and superior or above to the lateral sulcus. Okay, then you have the different gyrus here. First, you have your superior frontal gyrus. It is located superior or above the superior frontal sulcus. Then you have your middle frontal gyrus or gyrus. It is located between the superior and inferior frontal sulci. Then you have your inferior frontal gyrus. It is located inferior or below to the inferior frontal sulcus. Okay, just remember that when you see the word gyrus, it means the folds, and when you see the word your sulcus, it means the grooves. Okay, so the grooves and the folds are just adjacent to each other. Next, the parietal lobe. It is mainly for pain and temperature. It is the area posterior or behind the central sulcus and superior or above to the lateral sulcus. It also extends posteriorly as far as the parieto-occipital sulcus. Okay, then you can see your post-central gyrus, okay, beside your post-central sulcus. Then you have your intraparietal sulcus. So the fold above the intraparietal sulcus is called your superior parietal gyrus, and the fold located below the intraparietal sulcus is known as your inferior parietal gyrus. Next, the temporal lobe. It is mainly for hearing, smell, memory, the location of your Wernicke's area, specifically on the posterior portion of the superior temporal gyrus. It is the area inferior or below to the lateral sulcus. Okay, then you have your superior and middle temporal sulci, in which you can see your superior, middle, and inferior temporal gyri. Then lastly, you have the occipital lobe. It is mainly for vision. It is the area posterior or behind the parieto-occipital sulcus. Okay, so remember that the cerebrum, it has an outer grayish rim because you can see there the cell bodies, and then you have the inner white matter because the cerebral white matter consists primarily of myelinated axons, so the whitish appearance is due to the myelination. Okay, so in 3 types of tracts, you have the association, you have the commissural, and you have the projection tracts. First, the association tracts. So its axons can be seen between the gyri in the same hemisphere. Okay, so it's basically on the same side. Then you have your commissural tracts, so the axons can be seen on a gyri on one cerebral hemisphere to the corresponding gyri in the other cerebral hemisphere. So basically, its axons can be seen across, okay, from one hemisphere to the other. So one example would be your corpus callosum, in which it is the largest fiber bundle in the brain. Also, you have the anterior commissure and your posterior commissure. Then lastly, you have the projection tracts. So its axons can be seen in the cerebrum towards the lower parts of the CNS, like your thalamus, your brainstem, and spinal cord, and vice versa. So one example is your internal capsule. Again, an example of your projection tract is your internal capsule. It is a thick band of white matter that contains both ascending and descending axons. Now let's talk about the cerebral hemispheric lateralization. So during childhood, one hemisphere starts to dominate, and only after the first decade, you will now have a fixed dominant hemisphere. So that dominant hemisphere usually pertains to the handedness, perception of language and speech, while the non-dominant hemispheres refers to the spatial perception, recognition of faces, and music. So physiological differences also exist, although the 2 hemispheres share performance of many functions. So each hemisphere also specializes in performing certain unique functions. This functional asymmetry is termed as your hemispheric lateralization. The left hemisphere, it is mainly for reasoning, numerical and scientific skills, spoken and written language, and the ability to use and understand sign language. So again, in the left hemisphere, it receives somatic sensory signals from and controls the muscles on the right side of the body. Left hemisphere controls the right or muscles on the right side of the body. Damage to this area can lead to aphasia, or the loss of ability to understand or comprehend, as well as express speech due to brain damage. The right hemisphere function, so it is mainly for musical and artistic awareness, for spatial and pattern perception, recognition of faces, and emotional content of language. There is also discrimination of different smells and generating mental images of sight, sound, touch, taste, and smell. In addition, it receives somatic sensory signals from and controls the muscles on the left side of the body, so basically on the opposite side. Right hemisphere controls the left side of the body. So damage to this area can lead to your Broca's and Wernicke's area in the left hemisphere, in which the person will be speaking in a monotonous voice, having this ability to impart emotional inflection on what they say. Then lastly, you have the blood supply. You have the circle of Willis. So it lies in the interpeduncular fossa at the base of the brain. It is formed by the anastomosis between the two internal carotid arteries and two vertebral arteries. Again, it is formed by the anastomosis of your two ICA and two vertebral arteries. Then you have the anterior communicating, you have your anterior cerebral, internal carotid, posterior communicating, your posterior cerebral, and your basilar arteries that contributes to the circle. Okay, so just take note that your MCA or middle cerebral artery is not part of the circle of Willis. Okay, then you have your brain capillaries. So these are just capillary blood supply to the brain, in which you can see that there are numerous capillaries in the gray matter compared on the white matter, okay, due to the metabolic activity on the cell bodies. So the blood-brain barrier isolates the brain tissue from the rest of the body and is formed by the tight junctions that exist between the endothelial cells in the capillary beds. Okay, then you have your cerebral circulation. So the cerebral blood flow is measured through intracarotid injection or inhalation of certain substances like your radioactive krypton or xenon. Okay, then your cerebral blood flow occurs 50 to 60 ml per 100 grams of brain per minute. Okay, that is considered normal. First is your internal carotid artery or ICA. It is the bifurcation of the common carotid artery that divides into your anterior and middle cerebral arteries. Okay, so under the branches, you have the ophthalmic artery. It enters through your optic canal below and lateral to the optic nerve. So basically, it supplies blood to the orbital structures, the frontal area of the scalp, ethmoid and frontal sinuses, and the dorsum of the nose. Then you have your posterior communicating artery. It runs posteriorly above the oculomotor nerve to join the posterior cerebral artery. So your posterior communicating artery connects the posterior cerebral artery. Then you have your choroidal artery. It passes posteriorly and enters the inferior horn of your lateral ventricle and ends in the choroid plexus. So these are just little branches that supplies blood to the crus cerebri, your lateral geniculate body, and optic tract, as well as internal capsule. Then you have your anterior cerebral artery or ACA. It is the terminal branch of your ICA or internal carotid artery. So what connects both of your anterior cerebral artery? It is your anterior communicating artery. Okay, so your ACA basically supplies the leg area, okay, of the precentral gyrus or gyrus. Then you have the middle cerebral artery or MCA. It is the largest branch of your internal carotid artery and it runs laterally. It supplies all motor area except the leg area. Next, you have the vertebral artery. It is a branch of your subclavian artery passing through the foramina in the transverse process of the upper 6 cervical vertebra, your C1 to C6, into the foramen magnum. So it passes forward and medially on the medulla oblongata and at the level of the lower pons as it joins, forming the basilar artery. So the branches includes, you have the meningeal branches that supplies the bone and the dura in the posterior cranial fossa. You have the posterior spinal artery that supplies the posterior surface of your spinal cord. You have the anterior spinal artery that supplies the anterior medulla oblongata as well as the anterior spinal cord that is embedded in the pia mater along the anterior median fissure. Then you have the posterior inferior cerebral artery. It is the largest branch of the vertebral artery that passes between the medulla and the cerebellum. It supplies the inferior surface of your vermis. You have the cerebellum and the cerebellar hemisphere. It also supplies the medulla oblongata and the choroid plexus of the fourth ventricles. Then lastly, you have the medullary arteries. It is distributed along or all over the medulla oblongata. Then the union of the two vertebral arteries is called your basilar artery. It ascends in a groove on the anterior surface of the pons called your basilar groove, and at the level of your upper pons, you have there the two posterior cerebral arteries that will arise. For the branches, you have your pontine arteries that supplies the pons, the labyrinth arteries that accompanies your facial and vestibulocochlear nerves, supplying the internal ear. So it is also a branch of your ICA. Next, you have your ICA, your anterior inferior cerebellar artery. It passes posterolaterally and supplies the anterior and inferior parts of your cerebellum, as well as your pons and your upper medulla. Then you have your superior cerebellar artery. It arises close to the termination of your basilar artery and supplies the superior cerebellum, pons, the pineal gland, and the superior medullary velum. Lastly, you have the posterior cerebral artery. It lies posterolateral to the midbrain and joined by the posterior communicating branch of the internal carotid artery. Lastly, the veins of the brain. So they emerge from the brain and lie in the subarachnoid space, piercing through the arachnoid matter and the meningeal layer of the dura, and drain it all into the cranial venous sinuses. You have two cerebral veins. You have the external and the internal. Then under your external cerebral veins, first is your superior cerebral vein. It will drain towards your superior sagittal sinus. Your superficial middle cerebral vein on the lateral surface will drain into your cavernous sinus. Your deep middle cerebral vein and your anterior cerebral and striate veins will drain into your basal vein, and your basal vein and your great cerebral vein will drain into your straight sinus. While your internal cerebral veins, like your thalamostriate vein and your choroid vein, will drain into your great cerebral vein to your straight